Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 4 material, which is tissues, and specifically in this video, epithelial tissues. So remember from Chapter 1 when we talked about the levels of organization, we talked about how tissues are made up of groups or layers of cells with a common function. And we have 4 main tissue types. Epithelial tissues cover body surfaces and lines hollow organs. Connective tissue, just like its name implies, kind of connects the body and holds the body together and fills a lot of the space inside the body. Muscular tissue is important in, you know what, I just noticed this doesn't say muscular tissue. This is supposed to be muscle. Look at that. So the textbook gets it wrong. So that's muscle. Muscle tissue contracts and causes movement throughout the body and of the body. And then our nervous tissue is all about communication. It carries information from one part of the body to another part of the body. So when we talk about all the different tissues, we really want to talk about structure, function, location. So let's first talk about some of the structure stuff. So epithelial cells are arranged so that the cells are held next to each other to form continuous sheets. These sheets are used to cover the body and line cavities within the body. Epithelial tissue does not have a good blood supply, a condition called avascular. So vascular is like blood vessels, cardiovascular system, and avascular means no blood supply. These cells are attached to a basement membrane, and they receive nutrients from the blood supply of the underlying tissue. So you can see here, these are the cells that are all held together to form this sort of sheet on top. Those are the epithelial cells. And then here's the basement membrane. And then underneath that, you can see that there's a blood capillary. So all the nutrients and things that the blood is bringing goes through the basement membrane and up into the epithelial tissue, and all the waste goes back down into that blood supply. Now, since these cells form coverings and linings, they tend to get damaged a lot. And so therefore, they're constantly having to replace lost or damaged cells. And so epithelial cells rapidly divide. They're constantly dividing to replace anything that gets lost or damaged. They have many functions. They cover and line parts of the body, so their most important function is in protection, protecting the underlying tissue from abrasion, dehydration, or destruction. The next function is that every substance that enters or leaves the body must cross an epithelium. So these tissues help to control permeability. The epithelium also contains many sensory nerves, which detect changes in the environment and can relay those changes to the nervous system. And epithelial cells produce and secrete substances, and these are called gland cells. Gland cells can be scattered amongst other epithelial cells, or sometimes they're grouped together. You can see the 2 types of epithelium here. On the left are cells forming a sheet. These might have a few gland cells scattered within, but on the right you can see that they look quite different. These are a group of gland cells whose primary function is to produce secretions. Now, if you look at these glands, they can further be divided into exocrine glands, which are going to secrete into a duct. You can see a duct right here. So they all secrete into a common area, and then whatever they're secreting leaves. Or endocrine glands, which secrete directly into the blood. Sweat glands and mammary glands are examples of these exocrine glands. Pituitary gland, or maybe the ovaries, are examples of endocrine glands. We'll learn more about endocrine glands in the endocrine system. When we name epithelial tissue, we start first by determining how many layers it has. If there is only one layer, we call it simple. If there is more than one layer, anything from 2 layers to 30 layers is called stratified. The second part of naming these tissues is based on shape. The thinnest, most permeable shape of cell is called squamous. These are super thin, like flat pancakes. Slightly thicker are cuboidal cells. They are just about as wide as they are tall, so they make kind of a cube shape. And lastly is columnar, which are easy to remember because they look like tall, thin columns. No matter which shape we're talking about, see that they are all attached to one another, forming continuous sheets of cells. The different sides of the epithelial cells within the tissue have different names. The top or free surface is the apical surface. And the shape of the cells at this apical surface is what we use to determine the shape when naming. Let's take a closer look at these columnar cells. All epithelial cells sit on a basement membrane. They are attached to the basement membrane by intercellular junctions, and we'll talk more about that on the next slide. Remember, they receive nutrients and discard waste through this basement membrane to the blood supply underneath. You can see the cells at the bottom here don't look very tall and thin. They're actually kind of square. Each cell also has a lateral surface. So those are the surfaces on the side. Oop, sorry, it's hard to draw with this pen. The cells are attached to each other here by different intercellular junctions, and the top or free surface is called the apical surface, up on the top here. This is the one that's open to either the outside of the body or the inside of a hollow organ. Here we can see the tall, thin columns that give the stratified squamous epithelium its name. Stratified because it's more than one layer, columnar because it's got tall, thin columns on the apical surface. As I just mentioned, epithelial cells are held together by intercellular junctions. And let's talk about prefixes for a minute. Inter means between. So intercellular means between the cells. Intra means inside a cell. So intracellular would be inside a cell. And extracellular means outside. Extra means outside, so extracellular means outside the cell, around the cells. So we have multiple types of different intercellular connections, and they all have different purposes, right? Different structure means different function. I'm going to draw a couple of cells here. So these are going to be simple columnar epithelium. My drawing program is bad, and I'm not an artist, so let's pretend these are nice and clean looking epithelial cells. And they're all standing right next to each other, and they're sitting on a basement membrane at the bottom. So here is the apical surface on the top, and they're open, or they're facing maybe an open space, maybe inside the stomach or something like that. And the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that these are waterproof, that the acid, the stomach acid, isn't going to get down in between these cells and start digesting them. So the first type of intercellular junction that we're going to talk about is called a tight junction. And that actually makes these waterproof. It resists anything getting past them. There's no way through them unless you go actually through the cell itself. So that's a tight junction. The second type of intercellular junction we're going to talk about is the adherens junction. And these are actually a little bit different, and they basically are going to form kind of a belt around these cells to hold them together and give them some support. And this is used to resist shearing forces and resist separation between these cells. And you might see this in the digestive system where there's a lot of movement in the organs. And so if this one gets pulled that direction, this belt will help hold them together so this cell doesn't get broken apart. The third type, and the one we're going to actually spend a lot of time on in this class, is called a gap junction. So remember that name. I would love to erase these plasma membranes here, because what a gap junction is basically a tunnel between these two cells. So the cytoplasm on this side can go through, and the cytoplasm on that side can go through. So gap junction is when these two cells are connected by a little tunnel. And so information can go through the tunnel very quickly. Instead of having to go through this plasma membrane, through whatever space is between these, and then through this plasma membrane, which we know involves maybe active transport, or maybe it involves carrier-facilitated transport, we can go literally right through. So those are gap junctions. And desmosomes are kind of like little spot welds between these cells that help to hold them together. So there's just little spots. Oh, I should have made those a different color, sorry. Let's make them purple. So I'll just draw over this. So these are like little spot welds in between these cells that help to hold them together. And you're going to find them in, for example, the epidermis, like your skin, where it has to stretch and move in all different directions, and you don't want these cells to separate out. Now, there is one more type called a hemidesmosome, which is basically half a desmosome. And those guys, let's see, what color should we use? Maybe I'll do black. And those guys are going to anchor these cells down onto the basement membrane. So that is what's holding them down. So each one of these has a different structure, and each one of them has a different function, and really each one of them is found in a different place. So next we're going to discuss all the different tissue epithelial types, starting with the simplest one, which is simple squamous epithelium. Now remember, simple means one layer. Squamous means super flat cells, so the cells look kind of like this at the apical surface. And you're going to find these cells, because they're so thin, because they're so easy for things to diffuse right through them, like oxygen or CO2, you're going to find them in places where diffusion is important, like in and out of the blood vessels, in and out of the alveoli in the lungs. And this is looking at them from the top. So you can kind of see, here's a flat cell right there. You can actually see the nuclei from the connective tissue cells underneath. These are so flat, they're almost see-through. If we take away our simple layer and go to multiple layers and have a stratified squamous epithelium, this type of tissue has all of these different cells here. Would you want this in your lungs and have to get oxygen through every single one of these layers? That would be pretty far and a lot of different plasma membranes to go through there. So the function here is really for protection. And you're going to find this in areas where there's a lot of abrasion and a lot of friction. So that even if you lose the top, like 4 or 8 layers of cells, you've got some cells underneath that are still protecting the tissues underneath the epithelium. So places like the oral cavity or your skin. Simple cuboidal, remember simple is one layer, cuboidal is kind of these square cuboid cells, and they've got a lot of space in them. You can kind of see how much bigger they were. If squamous looks like this, squamous looks like this, there's really not a lot of space in there for much to be going on. If cuboidal looks like this, there's just a lot more space in there for the nucleus and other things to be happening. And in fact, you can see, here's a cell right there. You can see how nice and big and square that cell is. Their function is in secretion and absorption. So that nice big nucleus that we have in there, it's going to make a bunch of stuff, and this cell's going to store it and then secrete it out. Or sometimes you're going to have a situation where there's stuff out here, we're actually going to bring it into that cell for processing and maybe digestion of some type. So an example of where you would find these is the kidney tubules. So these cells form kind of a sheet that then becomes a tube. So if you imagine the sheet of cells looks like this, and then it wraps itself around into a tube like that. And so the tube is surrounded by these simple cuboidal epithelium. And that space in the middle is actually called the lumen. So a lumen is really any open space inside the body. You can have a lumen in the stomach, in the intestines, here in these kidney tubules, they have lumens. So it's sort of an empty space in the middle. And you're either making stuff and secreting it into a lumen, or you're taking whatever's in there and you're absorbing it out of the lumen. So stratified cuboidal epithelium have square cells that are at the apical surface. So remember, apical surface is the part that's near the lumen. It's the free surface. So here's the lumen in the middle, and you can see that the square cells are at the lumen, whereas the cells on the outside near the basement membrane aren't quite as square. And you can have many layers here, and so because there's many layers, still have secretion and absorption, but because there's many layers, you also have protection. And this example right here, these are actually sweat glands. So remember I told you you can have epithelial cells that all group together and their function is to actually produce something, to secrete something. So this would be an example of that, a sweat gland. So simple columnar cells are very large, tall, and skinny cells. Although they're only one layer thick, their function is absorption, secretion, and protection. They are often found with microvilli on the apical surface. And these microvilli, you can see up here, these little things, are projections of the plasma membrane from the surface of the epithelial cell. So they help increase the surface area. So imagine if you had this much room at the top of the cell, and if you had microvilli, you would actually increase the amount of plasma membrane that is open to the lumen. So you have much more room to absorb or secrete across microvilli. These guys are masters of absorption because of this massive surface area. It makes sense, therefore, that you would find them in the small intestine, where the primary function is to secrete enzymes, break down food, and then absorb the nutrients across the cell and into the bloodstream. There is another type of cell that is often associated with simple columnar epithelium, which is goblet cells. Goblet cells produce mucus, and you can see that here. It's actually sitting between 2 simple columnar epithelial cells. So this cell right here is also simple columnar epithelium, but it's a glandular cell because it produces mucus. And this makes sense that you would find it in the intestine because it provides lubrication for digested food to move through the digestive tract. And it helps protect the intestinal walls from stomach acid and other enzymes that is breaking down the food. So this guy is going to secrete out mucus. Stratified columnar epithelium are tall cells at the apical surface, and they have more than one layer. And their job is protection and secretion. And an example of where you might find them is in the salivary glands. So here you can see the lumen of a salivary gland duct, and these guys are going to be producing saliva into that duct, and then the saliva will move out of that duct into the oral cavity. So there's only 2 left, so stay with me. The first one, they're both a little bit weird, but the first one is called pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium, and pseudo actually means fake. So what does that mean? It means it's not really stratified, it's fake stratified. And if you look at it, it looks like there's a bunch of different layers, like there's a layer maybe and another layer there. But in reality, every single one of these cells is actually touching the basement membrane. So it's really simple. It's really only one level, but because it's so disorganized looking, we call it pseudo-stratified. Now these guys are also associated with goblet cells, and you find them in the trachea and the respiratory epithelium. And those goblet cells are producing mucus. Like simple columnar epithelium, we have protection, secretion, and absorption, but we have a new element here, and that's because these cells also are involved in movement. And that's because you have these little sort of brushes on the tops of the cells called cilia. These cilia beat back and forth, over and over, each one individually moving, but together forming kind of a brush. And those cilia help these cells move mucus and any particles trapped in the mucus up out of the respiratory tract. And our last type of epithelium is transitional epithelium. Now, I don't know how many layers this has because it changes. There's many layers to start from, and the purpose of this type of epithelium is to stretch and recall. So if you look here, this is epithelium that is not stretched out. You find this in the bladder. When it stretches and the bladder fills with urine, they stretch apart. So you can kind of see what happens to the cells. Here they are sort of all on top of each other. And then as the bladder goes from small to large, these cells kind of stretch out. After the urine is expelled, then it goes back to small again. So these guys, that's their purpose. That's it for today. See you in class.